forgot about the mic. So we're starting our meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order at 1:06 p.m. And I can confirm that we do have quorum of committee. So our first order of business, I will be reading the land acknowledgement today. And I'll start with, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe under the terms of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Number 61 of 1850 and the Williams Treaties of 1923. We commit to acknowledge, learn, educate, create opportunity, honor sacred places, and take actions toward real truth and reconciliation in support of our commitment to walking the path together in respect, peace, and harmony for future generations. And with that, I'll move to our first motion, which is to, it has been moved by Councillor Armour and seconded by Councillor Stone that it is recommended that the Planning Committee agenda dated July 13th, 2022 be hereby adopted as printed and circulated. All those in favor? And that carries. And I would ask, are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Okay, seeing none. We do have a special motion right now, which is to allow our Manager of Planning, Richard Clark, to participate in our hybrid electronic meetings. He would have been here today, but unfortunately had to stay home, so we have to suspend the rules of procedure to allow him to do this. So I have a motion moved by Councillor Stone, seconded by Councillor Armour. Be it resolved that committee suspend the rules of procedure 8.12.2.d related to hybrid meetings to allow Richard Clark, Manager of Planning, to attend electronically for the duration of the meeting. Questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? And that carries unanimously. So with that, I'll move to our public portion of the meeting. And bear with me as I read the formalities. I'd like to welcome everyone to the public portion of the meeting to consider applications to amend zoning bylaw 2008-66P pursuant to Section 34 of the Planning Act. The procedure of the public meeting will be as follows: a brief explanation of the purpose and effect of the application, and any correspondence received to date will be given by staff. The applicant or the representative will be asked to provide any additional comments without repeating the information already outlined by staff. Any members of the public present in person or electronically will then be permitted to ask questions or provide comments respecting the applications. Committee will then have the opportunity to question the applicant, the planner, or anyone giving presentations. Once the public meeting is concluded, the input received and proposed amendments will be considered by committee and council. Any persons making representation are requested to first state their name and mailing address. Please note that the presentations are limited to 10 minutes. Please also be informed that an appellant must provide an oral submission at the public meeting or written submission prior to the passage of the zoning bylaw. Otherwise, the Ontario Land Tribunal may dismiss the appeal. If you wish to be notified of the passage of a zoning bylaw, you must file either with the recording secretary or with the clerk a written request for notification prior to the passage of the proposed zoning bylaw. Each notice of complete application and public meeting included an explanation of the purpose and effect of the proposed amendment, and notice was required to be posted at the subject lands. Notice was therefore considered to have been provided in accordance with the provisions of the Planning Act and applicable sections of the Huntsville Official Plan. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first application, Z14-2022 HT plus B30-2022 HT, Chambers and Feist at 312 Hunters Bay Drive. Over to you, Madeline. And I should have been speaking in my mic, and my apologies for that. But now I have to turn my mic off.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, the subject property is located at 312 Hunters Bay Drive. The lot is designated urban residential within the Huntsville urban settlement area under Huntsville's official plan and is zoned Residential 1 in Huntsville zoning bylaw. The application is to rezone the west portion of the property from a Residential 1 zone to a Residential 1 with exception zone to reduce the westerly side yard setback on the retained lot from 1.2 meters to 1 meter for an existing 7-meter square shed only, and to reduce the rear yard setback on the retained lot from 10 meters to 2 meters for the existing one-story dwelling, specifically the 88-meter squared attached deck and gazebo only. The portion of the property subject to the rezoning coincides with the retained lot proposed through the concurrent consent application. The consent application is for the creation of one new residential lot and an easement for servicing. The serviced lot would have an approximate area of 797 meters squared and 33.8 meters of frontage on Hunters Bay Drive. The retained lot would have an area of approximately 1,330 meters squared and 50.4 meters of frontage on Hunters Bay Drive. As discussed in the report, both the retained and severed portions of the property are suitably sized based on the R1 zoning. However, with the proposed severance, the lot configuration changes as the retained lands would no longer be considered a corner lot. This changes all yard requirements for the retained lands, and due to this, the existing structures on the property become non-complying. Setback reductions are required for the retained lands as addressed through the rezoning. As mentioned in the report, permitted uses in the urban residential designation include a mix of residential dwelling types, where residential development is to be designed in such a way as to minimize land consumption and efficiently use infrastructure and community facilities. In this instance, as the proposed new lot is in a built-up area with access to public infrastructure and services, the proposal would assist in achieving suitable intensification and be in keeping with the official plan policies. The application was circulated in accordance with the provisions of the Planning Act. No objections have been received in relation to the application. District of Muskoka staff have provided no objection to the proposal. Through staff's review and analysis, the application would appear to conform to the intent of the official plan and be consistent with the provincial policy statement, and therefore staff are recommending approval. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you for that, Madeline. At this point, I would call upon the applicant or the applicant's representative. I see is here in person. Thank you.
Planning consultant for the owners. I think Madeline has outlined the application well. There's just a few points I want to touch base on. As she stated, the zoning, because of the current situation, Silverwood is the frontage of the lot, and where we're looking for the variance on the setback is going from a side yard or from a rear yard to a side yard to a rear yard because of the configuration of the new lot. The property that we are severing has over 30 meters frontage on the Hunters Bay Drive. The area is over the 650 meters squared. Both properties are currently zoned R1. We've also identified the frontage for the new lot to be on Hunters Bay Drive, and that affords a larger setback adjacent the house to the rear of the vacant lot. And so that's a 10-meter setback off of that property line. My clients have met with Hydro. There's currently a hydro line going across the building site, so they're going to have to redirect that through the easement that is proposed. Other severances have been done across the street on Silverwood of 50-foot frontages, and as I stated, even the retained lot is almost double the size of the requirement, but given the layout, no further development is proposed. The plan is for one single-family dwelling, which the majority of this neighborhood is. It meets the intent of the official plan by directing growth into the urban settlement area. And this area supports schools and walking to facilities. The density is far below the requirements allowed, and it's consistent with other development in the area. We have spoken about the district will require connections to municipal water and sewer, so the new lot will be fully serviced. As well, we'll be proposing an entrance likely off Hunters Bay, far away from the corner. With respect to the district official plan, the property is within the urban core, and as such, this is where growth is directed to. This will allow the owners to build their home on the excess lands that they own, their dream home, and eventually it'll allow for another house to hit the market, which is the existing one. The provincial policy supports utilization of existing infrastructure for development, and as I stated, the district has signed off on the water and the sewer, and we are on a municipal road. This is the location where the province sees growth. As well, we do have a school right across and another one just within walking distance, so that's a positive as well. And the woodshed that is sort of straddling the lot line, that will be removed. Staff asked us to rectify that, and my clients had no issue with that. And like I said, we've identified the building envelope just to make sure that we're not imposing any further on the adjacent lands. I'd be glad to answer any questions should you have any. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, John. At this point, I would ask if there are any members of the public, either here in person or electronically, that would like to speak to this application or ask a question. So,
as a reminder to members of the public who are present electronically, please use the raise hand button or press *9 to indicate that you would like to address committee. Chair Alcock, I see no hands raised.
okay, thanks very much for that, Jennifer. Okay, with that, I will read the motion. Before me, it has been moved by Councillor Stone, seconded by Councillor Armour. It is recommended that Planning Committee recommend approval of zoning bylaw amendment Z14 2022 HT, the purpose and effect of which is to rezone a portion of the property from a residential 1 zone to a residential 1 with exception, zone 2, reduce the westerly side yard setback on the retained lot from 1.2 meters to 1 meter for an existing 7 meter squared shed only, and reduce the rear yard setback on the retained lot from 10 meters to 2 meters for an existing 88 meter squared attached deck and gazebo only. So with that, are there questions from committee? Yes, Councillor Fitzgerald.
Just a comment, I would like to thank Madeline for the concise and detailed report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions? No? I will call the question. All those in favor? And that carries unanimously. Thank you very much, Madeline. All right. So with that, I am moving to the second application, and it was with regard to report number development 2022-118 OPA number 1 regarding the community planning permit bylaw implementation matters. And we will be joined by our manager of planning, Richard Clark, and there he is. Over to you, Richard. Welcome.
Thank you. You'll have to excuse me if my dog walks in. He really loves planning, so it's hard to keep away from the screen. So 1 second while I just share my screen. Okay. So through you, Madam Chair, the proposed official plan amendment before you today is official plan amendment number 1, and it's entitled the Community Planning Permit Bylaw Implementation Matters. As its name suggests, this amendment is to facilitate implementation matters, to facilitate implementation of the community planning permit system in the town of Huntsville. And this proposed amendment includes minor technical amendments to enable implementation of a town-wide community planning permit bylaw. The lands subject to the proposed amendment include all of the lands in the town of Huntsville. The Huntsville official plan was adopted in March 2019 and then was approved by the District of Muskoka in October 2019. The plan contains many policies that facilitate implementation of the community planning permit system in Huntsville already. The town decided to develop a Town of Huntsville community planning permit bylaw to implement the policies of the official plan throughout the entire town in November 2020. We'll be hearing more about the benefits of the bylaw and the final draft later on in the agenda. The rules governing implementation matters relating to the community planning permit system in Ontario are prescribed in regulation, Ontario Regulation 173.16, and these rules spell out certain preconditions for OP content should a local municipality wish to pass a community planning permit bylaw. As such, this amendment, which addresses the required this amendment addresses those required preconditions and should be adopted by council if we are to pass a community planning permit bylaw. The proposed amendment addresses implementation and clarification matters and addresses regulatory requirements in section F of the official plan. The implementation clarification policies are throughout the official plan. And essentially, we just looked at every policy that implements constraints through site plan control and zoning bylaw. And we just added the term community planning permit and related terms so that we could implement those same policies through this bylaw or through a bylaw. The rest of the changes, as I said, they're in the section F of the official plan, and they deal with such matters as the geographic area for a bylaw, should we pass one, OP goals, objectives, and policies that should be implemented in that bylaw, and various other requirements that are laid out in the Ontario regulation. Public notice and consultation for this amendment has occurred in accordance with the provisions of the Planning Act. And prior to this statutory public meeting, we did hold an open house on July 5th in the evening over at Town Hall. This amendment is being proposed, recommended for adoption by council. And should council adopt OPA 1, the amendment would be forwarded to District of Muskoka for approval. Under the prescribed rules in Ontario Regulation 173.16, council may pass a bylaw at the July meeting in the interim period between OPA adoption by council and approval by the district. So there's nothing to worry about there. And I would just want to reiterate that this is not the bylaw itself. This is just an official plan amendment to deal with technical matters so that the town can pass a bylaw. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you for that, Richard.
Let me just figure out how to stop sharing.
Okay, that would be helpful. Thank you. At this point, I would ask if there are members of the public here in person or electronically who would like to ask questions or comment on this. Not seeing anyone in the public.
Just a reminder, members of the public, if present electronically, please use the raise hand button or press *9 to indicate that you would like to address committee. And Chair Alcock, I do see one hand raised. They're participating via phone. So I will try and bring them into the meeting now, and hopefully we'll be able to hear them.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Maxine Bastido. My mailing address is 872 Williamsport Road, Huntsville, P1H2J4. Just clarification, this is the portion of the meeting where I would make my presentation in regard to the implementation and the amendment of the CPP permit plan.
Yes, it is. We can
Oh.
all hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll continue then. I have been, since it came to my attention, the CPP system bylaw, the process, which I understand from Richard, began November 2020. I have been reasonably, which is as reasonably as possible to gather information and formulate thoughts and put forward suggestions because I think it's presented as a convenient and easier, moving it into an easier mode to have happen. I understand some of that, but some of this fast tracking appears to me to be more so like development on speed dial. And I don't mean to be like to slight the process,
Mrs.
but I want to say,
Oh, Mrs.
Yes, go ahead.
Bastido, I believe you're commenting on the community planning permit itself, right? And at this,
yes and no, because it goes again. So are you telling me that this portion is just the amendment of the official plan?
yes. Sorry, so
Okay.
I think I heard something differently earlier, but my mistake, and so.
Well, it's probably both. I mean, I'm guessing. I could speak
Okay,
for myself,
all right,
though.
okay.
When I submitted my request to speak, I understood there were two parts to this meeting. One part was, as has just been most recently mentioned, the implementation of the amendment of the official plan to allow the implementation of the CPP. And the second
Absolutely
part,
correct, absolutely correct.
yeah,
So-
and then the second part was actually the final draft of the CPP is available and that kind of thing. And so to me, they're connected. And I think when I submitted my delegation, I was speaking to both because they are represented.
Okay.
But if it's better that I just speak to the implementation of the official, the amendment of the official plan, as is outlined in your meeting and what you're suggesting, I'm happy to do that, and I can speak to the other after if that's the preferred way.
Well, I think you have 10 minutes to use, although probably 8 minutes at this point. But so I think you speak to what you feel is necessary at this point. I just wanted to point out that at this point we were dealing with the official plan amendment itself. So, but if you think that they're related, then absolutely, you can go ahead and make your comments. Okay?
Okay. Well, I understand that as I understand, this amendment to the official plan needs to be in place to move the
does.
CPP
It does.
forward.
Yes.
And I understand that there is a final draft of the CPP, and I understand that it has not been approved, adopted yet.
Yes,
Also correct.
you are absolutely right. Yep.
Okay. And so in a sense, I understand the order, but in another sense, it seems to me that it would be, the permit would be approved first and then it would be implemented. But I understand also that it is going this way, and I can understand why, so that it's in place and so that it can actually happen. So obviously, perhaps if it's not already, I'm opposed to the amendment because I do not think this bylaw should be approved, accepted, especially at this time. And when I say especially, so in that sense, I oppose it. In that sense, I do not want the mechanism to be in place for the CPP system bylaw to be integrated into the official plan and then to be affected in that sense. And then there are issues, as I say, around the CPP itself, and they probably could fall under a few headings. One of them probably would be like the political will, the political environment regarding this matter, and in the broader sense. Another has to do with access to information. Another probably has to do with the broader implications, meaning this is Huntsville, part of the district, part of the province, etc. And so even though this amendment is presented as a minor and technical, in a sense, that amendment process itself is, but in reality, what it triggers, what it allows is not small. And it's not small in its scope. It's in terms of all of Huntsville and all of the mapping. It's not small as part of the District of Muskoka. It's not small as far as the official plans of Huntsville and of Muskoka. The intent of those generally are, to my understanding, 20 to 30 years. And then there are a number of amendments. And so I will go back to my points and I'll try to stay within my timeline. I have in front of me just some photos. One is of Mr. Wilson's retaining wall. Others are of Williamsport Road with the breach of the Beaver Dam before and after. Another is the article of in the Forester, Indigenous resident opposes Beaver Dam bylaw. That was Jessica Boland. I have in front of me pictures of following the community planning permit public meeting of April 26th. I have photographs of a commercial dump truck on the, would be the south side of my property on Williamsport Road, dumping large rocks and fill into a ravine. I have in front of me a picture of a Blanding's turtle. I have in front of me Appendix B, species at risk known or expected to occur in the District of Muskoka, endangered, threatened, species of special concern, Blanding's turtle, bobolink, eastern whippoorwill, common five-blind skink, common nighthawk, monarch, snapping turtles. On that list, I have had at my property and others. I have in front of me, and there are also these, I'm sorry, in terms of the species at risk, there are those in Muskoka that are known. There are also those in Muskoka that are not normally or naturally or often found in Muskoka that exist in Muskoka. I also have in front of me the article from the Forester, New Natural Resources Minister, town-facing charges. And so that's what I'm presenting in terms of the climate. I'm talking about the issues that haven't, in my opinion, been resolved, haven't been resolved fairly or properly. I'm talking about the overriding issues that are not specific to Huntsville, to the District of Muskoka. They are larger issues, provincial issues, federal issues in terms of species at risk. There are those species at risk, I understand, which have different influences, may I say? Like, for instance, a cougar has a larger range, is seen very rarely. It's a little more difficult. Blanding's turtle, by comparison, has a special status, and it is in the area. It is an endangered species, and it has regulation, which I understand has some teeth in it. I've been told some of the teeth may be broken.
Mrs.
but
Bastido, I just want to give you, you have 2 minutes left in your allotted time.
Okay, so wrapping that part up, I'm saying it's an overriding issue. It's large. I don't think this should even be progressing like it has. To me, it seems to be, the question, is it in good faith? Is it proper? Is it malicious? I don't mean this malicious, but the dumping of the fill in the ravine on Williamsport Road. I'm also, I just think that it shouldn't be continued given these matters are out there. It should be put aside until at least the election and the new councils and the new committees have been formed. I want to speak about access to information. My current situation, and for some time now, I do not have a home computer. So that limits me considerably. I'm not alone in that. There are people who have less opportunities than I do. I'm going to jump to what's important in that this particular meeting, I have put pressure on, in a sense. The intent was not pressure, the intent was access to information. There is some documentation at Huntsville Public Library. First, it was just the CPP without maps, not a draft, not marked draft. Second, it got to be CPP with marked draft with maps, but there was no official plan. Now, those are there, but they arrive after the meetings. Next to that, you need to have the district's official plan. You need to have the official plan, the Planning Act itself. Recently, it was said to me, that's not hard to do, we can provide that. It's not there. More importantly, I have asked twice by telephone and left message. I did not receive responses. My request was, is the current information at the Huntsville Public Library, is the information at the Huntsville Public Library current in regards to CPP? I didn't get a response. I asked again, I didn't get a response. I went into the library, looked at the information.
Mrs.
Yes?
Bastido, I have to interrupt because we actually are past the 10-minute time allotment, and we may have others who would like to speak to this amendment. So I want to say thank you for calling in and providing your input. I'm sure that councillors around the table will have taken note, again, of the concerns that you raise, certainly the ones that are directly related to the amendment before us. So I just want to say thank you again. And we are going to move on to...
May I make a final comment?
You may make a final comment, yes.
Okay, my final comment is the information that is at Huntsville Public is April of this year. The information in the final draft is July. It is a large document, a number of maps have gone with it. As of today's date, this meeting, I have not access to the maps. I'm just saying, to go forward with this without the information to be available, especially to peruse it and offer suggestions in a timely fashion, is not reasonable or logical.
Okay.
I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your comments. Much appreciated. Okay, with that, I will ask if there are any other members of the public who would like to speak to this amendment.
Chair Alcock, I see no hands raised electronically.
Okay, thank you for that, Jen. So with that, I do have a motion. It has been moved by Councillor Stone, seconded by Councillor Armour. It is recommended that amendment number 1 to the Town of Huntsville official plan be adopted and forwarded to the District of Muskoka for approval. With that, I would ask committee if there are questions or comments. If I, just a quick question of Richard, the reference to not having the information in the library, uh-oh, that's because that's, This is a new situation, so for the next minute or so, I'm sure the meeting has to officially shut down. Are we?
Richard's still there.
He's not on our screen. Okay, so who? I think we should stop this for 2 minutes while we. Okay, we don't have to stop it for 2 minutes. Where's Crystal? Crystal is here. We do, right? Is that the? We don't have to stop. Okay, we are going to recess for 2 minutes. 2 minutes, that's all, 2 minutes. Yeah. Our electric power went down, and I had one quick question. Is Richard still with us?
Yes, I believe he is, Chair
Okay,
Adcock.
quick question, which is in reference to the comments made about the documentation at the library. I just wanted Richard to confirm for people who may be listening that what documents were placed at the library and the timing of that. That would be helpful.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. Ms. Bastido is correct. The draft that will be on the agenda later today is not currently in the library. we can definitely add it or provide it to the library so that it can be made available. The second draft is the draft that's in the library, and it was provided after the second public meeting at the request of council. So we can definitely provide the final draft to the library so that it can be made available. And of course, if any of our members of the public would like to review it, they can either go on the website where it's available on myhuntsville.ca/CPP bylaw. And of course, we'll provide it to the library after this meeting.
Okay, that was very helpful. Thanks, Richard. Okay, I will look around. No more questions or comments. This is not, oh, you're a member, okay, sorry, we were at committee. My apologies, I hadn't realized your hand was up earlier, so if you have a question or comment? We're only dealing with the official plan amendment. We're still dealing with the official plan amendment.
Since I agree with Ms. Bastido, I think it's backwards. I think we should approve the planning.
Sir, if you could come forward, rather than, that would be helpful. Thank you.
I think I agree with Ms. Bastido in the sense I think things are backwards.
We need you in the, that would be helpful. Because others may be listening, so.
Fair enough. My name is Richard Herron. I live in Huntsville. My address is Box 5090, Station Main, Huntsville, Ontario. I agree with Ms. Bastido in the sense that I think that the first bylaw that's being dealt with to accept the planning permit process, I guess is how to word it, should wait until after we've approved or everyone's agreed that the larger document that is the permit planning process is accepted. And then if that's accepted, then you go to the other one.
Okay. All right, thank you for your comments. And I will turn it one more time over to committee if there is any follow-up with respect to that. It is, I will, in just a quick response, I hear your comments. Having said that, this is the process in which our staff have recommended, and we will be dealing with the permit itself later in the meeting. So, Your Worship.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just thought that maybe for clarification for the public as well, Richard could outline why we are doing the process the way we're doing it.
That's very helpful comment. Richard, did you hear?
Yes, I did.
Okay, perfect. If you could do that, that would be great. Thank you.
Not a problem. So through you, Madam Chair, the reason we have to do it this way is, as I noted, the community planning permit system in Ontario is governed by its own set of rules under the Planning Act, and they're prescribed in a regulation. And that one is Ontario Regulation 173/16. And in that regulation, it really does spell out how you're supposed to go about implementing a community planning permit system in a local municipality. And it requires that as a precondition to being able to pass a bylaw, you have to first adopt an official plan that contains certain policies. So when I say it's a technical amendment, it really is a technical amendment. It's really just hitting all the notes from that Ontario regulation that we are required to have in our official plan. And the process, the steps are as governed by that regulation. So we cannot alter from that path. And just maybe to set others' mind at ease, the bylaw can be a separate matter. So this amendment can go through and it really just sets the mechanism for passing a bylaw. It doesn't dictate whether or not we do pass bylaws. So I hope that helps answer that question.
Thank you for that. That was very, very helpful. And in essence, it's a tool. It's a mechanism as opposed to implementing the policy itself, right? So, thank you. With that, I'm actually going to call the question because I've asked this several times. All those, did anyone like me to read the motion again? No? Okay. All those in favor? And that carries unanimously. Thank you for that. Okay. So, I do have a final statement. Now that all comments have been received, I declare these public meetings respecting the above applications to be concluded. We will now move to the non-public portion of the meeting. And with that, we will start with our first invited presentation, and that is Paul Lowes from SGL Planning and Design with respect to the Huntsville Community Planning Permit final approval presentation. And I believe he's coming in through Zoom.
I am. Good afternoon, Madam Chair.
Okay, I can't see you.
Chair Alcock, I think Richard's going to be sharing Paul's presentation.
Okay.
But would you like me to put Paul on the screen for now?
Well, as long as there's no, that's fine. If Richard's sharing the presentation, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of committee. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'm going to run through the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Richard to run through the end of the presentation. There's a few matters on mapping the implementation that Richard's going to address. I'll address the rest of it, and Richard's going to forward my screen. And I am keeping my video off just to make sure I've got appropriate bandwidth and I don't glitch out. So next slide, please, Richard. So just as you recall, we've been before you a number of times. The team preparing the community planning permit system bylaw is composed of a town of Huntsville staff, Kirsten Maxwell, of course, Richard Clark, your planning manager, SGL, and Dillon Consulting. I'm Paul Lowes from SGL Planning and Design, and I will be working on the presentation, going through the presentation. Next slide, please, Richard. Just a brief overview. You probably all remember, just for an update, we're in the final throes of this bylaw. We've been through 5 phases of the bylaw approval with a fair amount of public consultation. We first presented the first draft of the bylaw to Planning Committee in September of 2021. We held open house in October of 2021, a statutory public meeting in October 27th of 2021. Then we prepared a second draft and held additional open houses, a second draft this spring, and held open houses in April 19th and 21st of this year. And then held another statutory public meeting on April 26th of this year. So this is the third and final draft of the bylaw that we're presenting to you today. Next slide, please, Richard. So what is a community planning permit system? Well, it's another planning tool. It's very similar to the zoning bylaw, but it allows a municipality to combine a number of different aspects into that same type of zoning approach. So it combines the zoning bylaw, it combines site plan control, it combines minor variance, all into one process upon which an applicant applies for and is given a permit, rather than given a zoning amendment, rather than giving a minor variance, rather than having to go through site plan control. All puts all that process all into one consecutive process, which helps to shorten the approval timeframes. Still the same amount of detailed analysis and review looking at an application, but it shortens approval timeframes because we can do it all at once. Also allows the municipality to impose conditions on development. You cannot apply conditions on a zoning bylaw. Although the Planning Act allows for it, the government has never imposed the regulations that allow for that. So it allows a municipality to impose additional conditions that have to be met before the permit is issued or finalized. It also allows more productivity for the applicant, although provides a fair amount of flexibility because we can have that variant system in the permits through that process. There's also no third-party appeals on any of the permit applications. So only the applicant can appeal if it's denied. Next slide, please. So you've seen this before. This is this graphic. It's also in the bylaw itself. What we're trying to do is show the difference between the existing approach, which is the traditional approach at the top, and the community planning permit system approach. And you can see the number of steps that is taken in the traditional process. First your bylaw amendment or variance, then site plan approval. You might need site alteration. You might need tree removal permit. It's all collapsed into one process to get you to a building permit. And rather than having council decisions and potential appeals throughout that process, it's simplified, as you see in the lower right-hand box, to 3 classes of permits: either staff approval with notice, or council approval under class 3. Just also point out that there's as additional process. If somebody wants to amend the community planning permit, they can do so, and that's an amendment process similar to zoning bylaw amendment. So that's something more substantive, and that would go through a full public hearing process. Next slide, please. So what have we heard? Well, we've and how have we done that? So there's been a number of public consultation, as I said, as well. There's been the project's been up on the website. There's been news letters, news feeds. We've done a number of stakeholder meetings, and as I indicated, we've done a number of public open houses and 2 statutory public meetings so far. Next slide, please. And from that most recent, since the April version, we've heard a number of additional comments, which we've taken into consideration, and I can just summarize them into these bullets. First, we heard again about the concern for vegetation removal or tree cutting concerns. And it was similar to what we heard in phase 1. And I think part of it was a bit of confusion with the way the text was set out, and additional clarification was definitely warranted, we realized from that. I think once we've explained it, it's a bit clearer, and we've explained it that really what the focus is on is trying to address clear cutting and also make sure that those significant natural areas are protected, but still allowing a vegetation removal in those. We found there's overall support for the regulation of clear cutting, particularly in those natural significant natural heritage features and areas. There was comments and questions about the development precinct, and the development precinct is those areas that are designated for development within the settlement areas, but haven't yet been zoned. And so what we've done is put those in a development precinct, which really means that further study and analysis is needed, similar to the existing process where you designate an area for, say, residential development, but it's still got a rural zoning, and the applicant must come forward with a zoning bylaw and draft plan of subdivision to implement that. That's similar approach with the development precinct. Is it still largely residential areas? Draft plan of subdivision still needs to be submitted, and we need that more detailed analysis to determine just exactly what precincts to apply to it. There's also questions about how existing site-specific zoning exceptions and minor variances are carried over. Also, how do we deal with current applications that are in the process, which I'm all going to explain to you. And then there was comments on property-specific mapping concerns, largely dealing with the boundaries of various precincts and clarification of those boundaries, and also how it reflected with the natural heritage overlay. Next slide, please. So this graphic, it just explains again, just how we've gotten to where we are. We've started off with background review, best practice is the official plan, current zoning bylaw. We went through and reviewed all the recent minor variances and to see trends. We prepared a key directions report back in 2021. We prepared 2 different drafts of the zoning bylaw, all with public consultation, right from the key directions through to those 2 drafts. And now we're in the 3rd and final draft of the bylaw. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to cover off some of the key changes and summarize those for you. This is the key changes from the 2nd draft, that April version. And I'm going to just walk you through the section. So most of the changes are actually in section 1, the administrative section. So the first one is vegetation removal provisions. We had in 2 separate sections. We had it in the section 1, the administration with exemptions, and we also had it in the general provision section. We found that was adding to the confusion for the public to try and understand the provisions, and it wasn't clear. So we've combined all that and tried to really simplify and clarify it under the section 1, under the exemptions. We've also clarified just what exemptions there are for tree cutting. So there's vegetation removal for forest management is exempt from the bylaw, except where there's clear cutting. And there's a definition of clear cutting in the bylaw, which is cutting an area of 1 hectare or greater, consecutive area 1 hectare or greater. Unless the tree cutting is supported by an approved forest management plan. And when we say vegetation removal for forest management, that means cutting it for firewood, cutting it for any personal purposes, cutting it for commercial purposes. That is exempt unless it's clear cutting, falls in the definition of clear cutting. We also exempt vegetation removal in the rural and waterfront precincts, except for clear cutting or within 10 meters of abutting roads and within certain natural heritage features. Despite that, there's also an exemption for cutting within those areas for firewood, personal use, that type of matter, which also set out in the bylaw. Vegetation removal in the urban residential shoreline precinct is exempt as well, except again for clear cutting or within adjacent to water courses, wetlands, and the natural constraint overlay. Next slide, please. Also clarified site alteration and the placement of fill. We've increased that to 10 cubic meters overall. So any fill up to 10 cubic meters over fill is exempt from a permit. Also, vegetation removal or site alteration to allow a temporary access into a site, into a property for collecting data to submit a technical report. For instance, they need to go in to do boreholes or to do other aspects to finalize a technical report. That is exempt, provided any vegetation removal is authorized by the Director of Development Services. Next slide, please. Also in administration, we've updated the transitional matters to address applications in process. Essentially, any application that's currently in process, a zoning amendment or site plan amendment, would continue in that process and even through any appeals in that process until it's been finalized, and then it will be incorporated into the new CPS bylaw through a site-specific provision if required. We've also clarified that any building a structure that's already been authorized by minor variance or a site-specific bylaw amendment will be carried forward in this bylaw. And what we've done is added two appendices. Appendix C includes all existing site-specific bylaw amendments. So it's been added to the bylaw. So they now, all the site-specific bylaw amendments in the zoning bylaw are now become part of this, this new CPP bylaw. Where a holding provision has been implemented, the conditions imposed by those holding provisions will continue to apply. And those existing holding provisions have been added as in Appendix D of the bylaw. And as the last point, just summarizes those two appendices. Next slide, please. In general, the general provisions, we've added permit requirements and setback requirements for sensitive land uses adjacent to pits and quarries, and also adjacent to railways and rail yards. We've added provisions for development within hazardous forest types for wildland fires, and that's defined in the bylaw, and it's subject to provincial requirements of what is a hazardous forest type. We've added provisions relating to community benefits. This is your community benefits you would require where a proponent is asking for additional height and density beyond which is set out in the community planning permit bylaw. So if someone applies for it and the planning committee and council believe that is appropriate for that amendment, then you'd be looking for community benefits in support of that approval. We've also added requirement for water access only properties to demonstrate that they have appropriate mainland parking for their waterfront water access only property, including confirmation of any authorizations, approvals, and agreements. So this would be for new water access property. So creating a new lot that is water access only, not existing lots. Next slide, please. Under the parking provision, we've reduced the parking requirement very slightly for multiple residential buildings from 1.5 per unit to 1.25 per unit plus one space for every 5 units. So it's just slightly less than 1.5 with that revised provision. Next slide, please. In the precincts, we've added seasonal outdoor patio as discretionary use, accessory to a restaurant, where in all precincts where, of course, where a restaurant is permitted. We've updated the requirements for minor development within flood zone overlay, and we've added symbols for each precinct, so help the readers understand those precincts by the symbols. Next slide, please. And we've separated the natural constraints overlay into, and this you'll see it on the maps, into a natural constraints overlay 1 and a natural constraints overlay 2. Next slide, please. And in the definitions, we've added a number of new definitions: at capacity lake, trout lake, garden suite, the hazardous forest types for wildland fires that I referenced before, mineral aggregate resources, there should be a comma here, seasonal outdoor patio, sensitive land uses, and utility shed. Next slide, please. And I think we're going to get into the mapping, and I'm going to turn this over to Richard to go through the mapping changes.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, I'll go through the mapping changes. And just to high-level overview, we did change the maps to address some of the comments we heard. We updated legend colors because we heard from some individuals, some commenters, that there was some issues with discerning the different colors. So we tried to reinstitute some of the colors from the previous zoning bylaw, which people were more used to. We added site-specific exceptions based on certain comments that we had heard at the public meeting and in written comments on the second draft. And those are presented in a new section 6 to the bylaw. So all those exceptions, as the last bullet states, are now shown in Schedule 6 of the bylaw. And that's going to be a section that will be updated over time whenever a landowner goes through a CPP bylaw amendment to change a precinct and maybe change the lot requirements or the setback standards or something, we have a table now that we can capture all those site-specific exceptions in. I should, just before I go on, I should also note that those exceptions, both the exceptions from the previous zoning bylaw and the new exceptions related to the CPP bylaw, are also illustrated on all schedules for the CPP bylaw precinct mapping. The next thing I wanted to go through with you guys is mapping amendments that we have that have come up as a result of the release of the final draft and some comments that we've heard. And some of these were also changes we made in the second draft that didn't get carried through to this final draft. So we have to make some amendments to the mapping so that we can capture those correctly. Because we did hear comments about mapping on the first draft we released too. So I'm just going to go through them really quickly. And just to note that there is a recommended set of amendments that we think should be attached to the resolution to capture all these amendments. So this first one is just, we had a request from individuals in the Lake Wasiosa area and just related to making a change to the road allowance on Treasure Island to make it open space. And we were happy to do that. And we did that in the second draft. And now we're just making sure that it's also in the final draft. This second amendment relates to a parcel of land in the Huntsville Urban Settlement area on Chaffey Township Road, 133 and 143 Chaffey Township Road. And there was a comment that rather than that it is Hydro One land and is used as a Hydro One facility, and rather than being an urban residential medium precinct, it should be changed to a development precinct. So that again was a change we made in the second draft, and we would just like to make sure that that change is carried through to this final draft. And this is just the same map, but we have a zoomed in set of maps now for this settlement area so that we can see all the exceptions better. So when we're making this change, we're making a change to map F9 and map F92. We would like to make a change to map F10, which is in the Hidden Valley area, and it's just on the north side of Highway 60. It's 1030 Highway 60. Right now it's zoned open space, and it's designated in the official plan as, I believe, resort recreational residential. And in recognition of the fact that it has been designated for that use, we would like to make it change the precinct from an open space to a development precinct. And as Paul described earlier, the purpose of that is to make sure that when a landowner comes forward with an application to develop a site like that, there's a comprehensive site-specific planning exercise that goes forward. This is also on the same map and deals with 146 and 245 Grandview Drive North. And the change being proposed here is to take the areas that are highlighted as recreational resort residential precinct and change those also to development precinct for the exact same reasons that I mentioned earlier for that parcel to the south. The fifth amendment we would like to suggest is further down Highway 60 on Grassmere Road, 42 and 100. We heard from the landowner in the, at the time the first draft came out, that they wanted us to take another look at the fact that the precinct was waterfront backlot. And we did look at it at that time and changed it to the rural precinct. but that wasn't in the final mapping, so we're making sure that it is now. The sixth amendment deals with various lands along Greer Road in Port Sydney, just along Highway 11 or near Highway 11. These are all lands that are in the Port Sydney community area and were identified in the official plan as, I believe, community business lands. However, they're currently zoned for only rural one uses. So we felt it would be more appropriate to have those in the development precinct so that if someone was to establish any industrial or commercial uses on them, there would be a planning exercise they would go through. And it would be the equivalent to a zoning amendment. So those were all identified as development precincts in the second draft mapping. So we're just really making sure that they continue to be development precinct. This change has to occur to map K3 and K4. So that's why you see both maps here. And then the final change that we're suggesting needs to be made is relating to the North Granite Ridge golf course at 476 South Mary Lake Road. We had heard from an agent of the owners that we had mapped the precinct incorrectly for the area just to the west of the red oval, and they had it was mapped as open space in the first draft, so we did change it to development precinct, but unfortunately we also changed the mapping for the golf course portion of the lands, which wasn't appropriate. So the idea, or this change, is to change that portion back to open space. And I realize I'm going through this very fast, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to detail them. Just wanted to review for you the commencement date rules relating to the zoning the CPP bylaw and the OPA that we heard earlier about. So as we reviewed, you really do have to do the OPA first, and then you can pass the CPP either concurrently or after. So OPA 1 would be adopted by council, and the CPP bylaw could be passed by council concurrently, and that's the goal for July's meeting. OPA 1 would then be submitted to the district, and I wrote approved by the district, but I guess the idea is we hope it would be approved by the district in short order. The commencement date then would be, because there's a few things going along multiple tracks. So if there are no appeals, the day after the last day of filing notice for an appeal would be, for the OPA, would be the commencement date. And if appeals are received for either the OPA, for the CPP bylaw, the day after the day on which those appeals on the bylaw or the OPA are disposed of by the tribunal would be the effective date or the commencement date of the bylaw. So just did some rough math, and it's a minimum 20 days after the notice of approval would be received from the district on that OPA. So it could be mid to late August. We just wanted to put that out. And of course, that would be if there are no appeals. So that means that there are a number of things that we have to work on simultaneously because the commencement date is on the horizon. So we would have to make a number of changes to bylaws, and these are planning related bylaws or procedural bylaws or the user fee or the fees and charges, bylaw, just to name a few. And those amendments would have to be timed to more or less coincide with the commencement date. so that we would be able to start receiving applications, processing applications, and approving applications. There'd also be a number of policies relating to planning matters that we would have to work on updating, reviewing first and then updating as needed. So some of those, for instance, they deal with shoreline revegetation, for example, through planning applications, but obviously they wouldn't address the community planning permit application process. So we would have to update that. So that's just an example of one. One thing that we really want to do, and it's largely because of many of the comments we've heard about the exemptions, some of the confusion about those things, and also just because it's a completely novel approach, is we would like to prepare education and implementation guide. So there's a recommendation in this report about doing that work, and that work we would be using that for rolling out the bylaw to various user groups. It could be shared with realtors, it could be shared with the building and development industry, and then it would also be a tool for staff to use to guide through the process. So we really think that's an important step, and it's largely because a lot of the comments we heard were about providing additional clarity. So that's also a recommendation. And then I think that's it. So I would just welcome any questions if you have any, and I'll just turn my screen off.
Thank you both, Paul and Richard. And so, Richard, I'm assuming that you've just covered off your separate report in our agenda package, right? And I can proceed to the deputation request. Yes, okay.
That's right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And so we, in fact, did have a request for one deputation, and so I will ask Mr. Simpson to join us right now.
Bush, it's on. Oh, yeah, I see. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. Wayne Simpson, Tulloch Engineering, 80 Main Street West, P1H1W4, I believe. But anyway, so I've spoken to the committee in the past about the community permitting bylaw, planning permitting bylaw. Firstly, I'm pleased that the comments I made at the public meeting I believe in April or so with respect to the zoning exceptions, that's been carried forward, and as well some of the zoning amendments that were made more recently, for example, the one for Sheetles, just recently, that's reflected in the new community permitting bylaw, and so we're pleased with that. I'm here today speaking on behalf of Clubland Corporation and North Granite Ridge Golf Course. In the initial draft of the community planning permitting bylaw, I raised concerns that the designation on their properties was not reflective of the official plan designation. In Clublink's situation, some of the lands on the north side of Highway 60 are designated resort recreational residential, and in the case of the North Granite Ridge property, the lands are designated community residential in the Port Sydney community. After the first series of maps were produced, the town introduced in the draft a concept of a development precinct, and that causes a lot of confusion and is something that I've been asked to convey to the committee again, and this is not a veiled threat or anything, but I've been told that the bylaw will be appealed if this concern is not addressed, and I believe there's good reason for that. The comment that's been made even tonight is that the development precinct is appropriate because it ensures that a site-specific bylaw amendment will occur to establish the principle of development on lands and appropriate performance standards. And so the suggestion is is that without, if some other designation is applied to the property other than a development precinct, the development precinct is the only way in which the municipality can be assured that there's going to be an amendment. But that's not the way it happens in the planning approvals process. You know, those tracts of land are only going to be developed through such things as applications for draft plan of subdivision or draft plans of condominium. There's going to be a myriad of studies brought forward as part of those applications as a requisite requirement. And in the course of that, there will probably be a need to fine-tune the zoning on the property to reflect such areas as natural hazard areas or other things. So there's an expectation on the part of my clients to appreciate that just by having in the case of Club Link, having the resort recreational residential designation on their development tract, and in the case of North Granite Ridge, having the community residential designation, doesn't mean that tomorrow they can run out and start to develop it. I mean, at most, they could probably build one house or something on a property. There would be some use of the land, but it wouldn't allow them to, to develop this whole tract of land without going through the standard process. And I appreciate the comments of the consultant that historically the municipality's has used the rural zoning designation on some of the development lands within the urban area. For example, on Earls Road, for example, part of that property that's scheduled for development is zoned rural. I think it's important to understand that, in the course of doing this whole permitting thing, first I would want to point out that in section 411 of the second draft, I think it's 411 still, it defines or describes what the development precinct is. It's probably the shortest section I've ever seen in any bylaw in my lifetime. It basically says the development precinct means the only permitted uses are the uses that exist on the day that bylaw is passed, which in the case of Club Links is vacant. So the use is vacant land. So I've never heard vacant as being defined as a permitted use on a property, but that's what it would be. And then the other aspect of it all is that there should be development standards prescribed in that, and there's none. So in accordance with section 1.2.3 in the draft bylaw, again, the community permitting bylaw precincts are identified in the schedule. The precincts are specific areas that are applied to all lands within the town to describe permitted and discretionary uses, and to describe the applicable development standards. That's what the purpose of the bylaw is, and that's stated in the bylaw. And that's what's stated in the background report when the bylaw was being contemplated back in December 2020. So the question then is the development precinct even a permitted provision in the bylaw? And I suggest not. Section, as Richard said, under the provincial regulations, Regulation 173/16, where the authority for municipalities to pass community planning permitting bylaws, there are specific requirements. And as Richard described them, they're unique to the CPP process. And included in the regulation states that a community planning permit bylaw must set out and define the permitted uses of land and set out a list of minimum and maximum standards for development. And I contend that if the bylaw does not do that with respect to some of the lands in Huntsville, then what the bylaw is sort of ultra vires or beyond the authority of the municipality to pass with that development precinct provision in place. By way of an example, I would suggest to you on the Club Links property, as Richard pointed out, there's a map F10, which Richard showed was in part showing pockets of development land that would be recreational resort residential, but then there's this other part that's adjacent to Highway 60 that is in the last draft is shown as being open space, and now it's going to be development precinct. So in talking to Club Link, the question that they raised was, if all these lands are in the same designation in the official plan, if the purpose of the CPP bylaw is to implement the official plan, to correspond to the official plan, why do we have lands that have the same designation but two different precincts applied to them. And it's a legitimate question. I mean, if Club Link's in the business of golf courses, but they're not in the business of developing residential projects right now. So they would logically be looking at, partnering with somebody or going forward with a development for their, in and amongst the golf course, the back nine of the golf course. And so they would be talking to somebody, a developer, and they'd be saying, I know when you look at the map, these are two different things, but in reality, they're not two different things. They're the same. And that's a pretty difficult thing to suggest to somebody. And then when we look at Port Sydney, the North Granite Ridge property, there was an OMB hearing on that, or LPAT, or whatever it might have been called at the time, to designate part of that lands from open space to community residential. And that's what my clients were wanting to have attached to it. To the west of that, there are other lands that are now proposed to be development as well. And beyond that, there's this area that was proposed to be community and rural business, and it's being designated development precinct. So if you look at a map of Port Sydney, when the mapping has changed, you'll see this, it was purple before. I don't know, it's sort of a flesh tone color now, but there's an area there that's a large area. It's probably got, 500 acres of land, and it's all going to be colored the same way. And if someone is looking at normally you look at the zoning bylaw to sort of see, well, what can I do? If I'm buying this, what can somebody do beside me? If I'm buying it, what can I do? And if you look at the community permitting bylaw, it's going to say development precinct means diddly squat. You can do nothing. And it doesn't shed any light on somebody's concerns about, if I buy this and I can build a house, what's going to happen beside me?
Wayne, I just want to give you.
10 minutes.
No, 2 minutes left, actually.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's important to recognize that the development precinct is a non-designation. It's ambiguous, it's confusing, it's contrary to the legislation, the regulation that's specific to the CPP. All we're simply asking is that the municipality in the CP bylaw attach the designation that corresponds to the official plan designation, the appropriate precinct designation that applies to that's in the official plan. Again, somebody looking at the property is going to first look to the CP bylaw, and they're going to be thoroughly confused. And then they're going to have to go to the official plan to try to understand, well, what was really intended here. And as well, it doesn't give anybody any sense of the development standards, minimum or maximum. It doesn't give any discretionary uses. It basically says to these clients of mine, you've got this tract of land. It's in a community designation where development can take place, but you can't do anything with it today. And we can't even we're not even going to give you some guidance as to what you might expect in terms of lot sizes, minimum, maximum, those sorts of things, density coverage. And effectively, if either of these clients wanted to get a development permit to cut a tree, there's nothing applicable to them. There's no standards in any way, shape, or form. So, not that they're running out and cutting trees, but the reality is this is just between the first draft and the third draft, a problem has been created where none existed previously. Thank you very much, Ruth.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And actually, Wayne, if you just stay there for a minute, I want to read the motion the first motion that's before us, and there might be a question from committee of you before you go back. So it has been moved by Councillor Fitzgerald, seconded by Councillor Stone. It is recommended that Planning Committee recommends approval of the Community Planning Permit Bylaw attached to Report Development 2022-120 as attachment number 4. And with that, I would ask if there are questions or comments from committee. And starting while Wayne is with us, if there are any for Wayne. I have a question. And quickly, I hear what you're saying, Wayne, about the whole concept of the development precinct, but my understanding is that whether it was zoned resort, recreational, residential, I think that's right, versus development precinct, in either case, the applicant would have to come forward with fairly extensive plans, whether it be a plan of subdivision supported by all of the documentation to support that proposed development. So in my mind, and this I'm seeking clarification from you, in either case, your client would have to present extensive studies and detailed planning applications. So I need clarification as to why one is significantly worse, given both require the same kind of information.
Well, for one thing, the development precinct designation says you can't use the property for anything other than the existing use. So you can't do anything on it at all. And it's correct to believe that a development tract of land will be required to go through a process. But if you wanted to apply the same logic, you could say that every property in Huntsville, regardless of where it is, that's not, positioned to be a single-family residential development, that has the potential of being intensified or densified or whatever, should also be development precinct, because you're going to compel them to go through a process. And the reality is, the development precinct, it does not implement the official plan. In the background paper for it, it says the official plan sets out the policies that are to apply to many and all land use designations. And it goes on to say that the CP bylaw will identify a number of community planning precincts to which standards of the bylaw will be applied. Those precincts will be based on the boundaries of the land use designations in the official plan. So the development precinct is totally ignoring the boundaries of the precinct, of the official plan designations, because, again, in Port Sydney, we've got 400 or 500 acres of land that's all designated the same way in the CP bylaw, but they're not designated the same in the official plan.
Thank you, appreciate the response. So, Your Worship.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Wayne, and this might be a question more for our Richard, but as Richard was presenting to us, I felt like by changing the precinct to development from the existing ones, both at Grandview and down at North Granite Ridge, he was addressing a concern that you had raised before. But are you telling me that that was a concern, the existing zoning on them? You just don't like it being changed to the development? You wanted it changed to rural? Is that what I'm hearing from you? Or,
No.
and if so, and then I would ask Richard why we couldn't have followed that route.
Okay, if I might, Madam Chair, in the case of the Clublink property, when I spoke to the committee the first time, when I looked at the first draft of the mapping, the Clublink property was all zoned open space. Basically in the draft CPP. And I went back and said, well, that's not appropriate because some of the lands have been designated in the official plan as recreational resort residential. And I asked that those lands be changed that way, and that as well, that the open space zoning designation continue to apply for the golf course, because I was saying, that what you're, if you changed it all to development precinct or recreational resort residential, the golf course would be a legal non-conforming use. Right. So I was looking to have, the same zoning designation applied to the development pods plus this other tract of land that we're talking about. In case of North Granite Ridge, the original plan showed it as open space, which ignored the OMB decision that it should be residential, and the lands to the west of it were shown as community residential. When we got to the second draft, the open space was removed from the North Granite Ridge property, and the development precinct was applied to it, but then the development precinct was applied to the adjacent lands. So when I spoke at the public meeting, I spoke in opposition to the development precinct designation, regardless of where it was. But in terms of these two properties, I was speaking specifically about them because I haven't seen a map that corresponds to what we want yet.
Yes, Your Worship.
So follow up, it almost sounds to me like you're trying to get those two specific lands rezoned to the zoning you want on them today through the CPP process as opposed to through an application process.
No, I would, through you, Madam Chair. Yeah, to some extent, that's true. The reality is that we know, that the lands to be developed, they'll have to go through an extensive process, in terms of a design process. If they're plan a subdivision or whatever, there's going to be extensive review. There's going to be, in every plan a subdivision or draft plan a condominium or whatever, there's always a condition that the lands be zoned in accordance with the development plan and respecting the EIS and other things that are done. So what I'm saying is that, to put a development precinct on it, which is really sort of like, it's almost like a holding thing, without any guidance as to what the use is, no guidance at all, it doesn't reflect the official plan. And so what I'm saying is put the community residential precinct designation on the North Granite Ridge property. And we know that because it's on all of that property, it doesn't mean that the whole thing can be developed for community residential, because there's a stream running through it. It's going to have to be zoned environmental protection. If there's areas of land that can't be developed, they might have to be zoned conservation or something else. We have to go through a process, but right now we're basically sort of saying, you have to go through a process. It's sort of like there's a failure to recognize that we have to go through a process. This development precinct is basically being thrown down to sort of saying, you must go through a process. And we know we have to go through a process because you don't develop 70 acres with one house on it. If it was community residential, you could build a house and you could have, great area running around the back, but they're development lands. And so under the regulations say you have to define the permitted uses, the discretionary uses, the minimum and the maximum standards. That's what, under the regulation, that's what the CCP bylaw must do. And putting a development precinct designation on the property does not do that.
Your worship.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wonder if we could go to Richard and just ask him for the rationale for going to a development
Yeah.
process, and maybe a response to Wayne's comments about it's not detailed enough.
That's great. Richard, you're there.
Thanks. I had my hand raised. I was just going to try and add that exact piece. So through you, Madam Chair, I think it helps to remind ourselves that we did get comments from multiple individuals when we were doing the various drafts. And as you know, and you heard just now, that we received comments from Mr. Simpson on behalf of some of his clients, and they related to some of the properties that we've talked about. Now, we also got comments from individuals who were not overly happy that one of our drafts of the bylaw showed portions of land where the precinct was rural and then was changed to, for example, a residential without there being a planning process. And one of the things we heard from, just to remind everyone, one of the things we heard from yourselves is that one of the things people were apprehensive about was the fact that we were taking away appeal rights, we were taking away the regular zoning type notice provisions, and of course the appeal rights afterwards. So what we thought is, if we needed to come up with a mechanism that would trigger the need for an actual amendment to the CPP bylaw. So everything under the CPP bylaw, if it's got a precinct, if it's pre-zoned, so to speak, it would go through the class 1, class 2, or class 3. And it's only if you were going to be changing a use that wasn't currently permitted under a precinct that you would have to do a precinct or a CPP bylaw amendment. So by putting a development precinct in place for these types of lands where there hadn't been a previous planning exercise that's gone through, our goal was to make sure that those types of properties would have the equivalent to a zoning bylaw amendment. So that was the objective, and it was based on some of the comments we heard from others. So I hope that, so I think that might be the one of it boils down to is if we didn't have something like this, then some of those previous rights, like appeal rights, wouldn't necessarily be there. So, and in terms of what Mr. Simpson is saying about the regulation, I think our development precinct is fine. I think it stipulates that the permitted uses are the uses that are existing on the day of passing of the bylaw. And in terms of the lot requirements, you're supposed to say what the lot requirements, the applicable lot requirements are. And the applicable lot requirements are as existed on the day of passing of the bylaw. So, or sorry, no, they're not. There are no applicable lot requirements. So that's how that would that's how I would interpret that. I'm not sure if Paul had anything to add, but I just wanted to remind you of the background.
Richard, if I may, I just to follow up on that. So what I'm hearing is something in place so that the applicant wouldn't be circumventing a planning process, right? So that's one. But I'm wondering, is there any, is by dedicating this as development precinct, are we being consistent with the official plan? You know, there has been discussion around this isn't consistent with what we have in our existing official plan, if I'm hearing that correctly. So can you speak to that, please?
Right. So I think what's being said is that the OP has land use designations for the lands that Mr. Simpson is talking about, and the development precinct doesn't match those designations. But that's I don't see that as a non-compliance. I see that those uses could be permitted if an application was submitted to establish the appropriate limits of development in consideration of various constraints on site and in consideration of the various technical studies. So there are other policies in our official plan that say those types of things have to happen before a development can proceed. So I don't see an issue there. So that's how I would answer that. And I'm not sure, as I say, I'm not sure if Paul has anything to add.
So I am going to, before Paul has a chance, so I understand your last comment correctly, and I think that explained it to me. So if an application comes forward and it has a designation of development precinct, the applicant would include any reference in the official plan as part of the supporting documentation. And in the official plan, it would reference what the proposed land use might be in that area. So that would sort of form part of the supporting documentation.
Yeah, and I'll just point out that it's not uncommon for local municipalities to use this type of a tool, a development zone or a development precinct, and it is to ensure that that the appropriate applications are going to be submitted, and before the principle of development is established. And of course, one of the things that you would need to show in support of your application is that the uses you're proposing are appropriate in consideration of the land use designations in the official plan. So it's definitely not outside of normal practice for this type of a mechanism to be used.
Okay, thank you for that. And did Paul want to add to that, or I think you covered it really well. Thank you, Richard. Oh, Paul is okay. All right.
Madam Chair, I was just going to build on what Richard said. He's absolutely right. Many other municipalities, when you're just going through a typical process, official plan zoning, when municipalities do their overall official plan and new official plan, they don't zone those new greenfield areas for the final zoning. What they'll often do is leave it in a development zone or a rural zone, but the development zone gives it one more step. It indicates to the owner and to others that this is going to be an area for development. It's not rural, it's not long-term rural, it's for development, which is in conformity with the official plan. It's just the specifics aren't addressed. The other important thing that I just wanted to add that Richard didn't mention was under the CPP bylaw process, there's no longer any ability to apply a holding zone. That's only under zoning. So it's not like we could implement the official plan by putting a precinct on it and then put a hold on, waiting for those further studies. We can't put a hold on. So the development zone gives the municipality certainty that those further studies that Mr. Simpson said have to be done will be done, and the refinements of those precincts will be done through that process.
Okay, that's very much appreciated, a lot of clarification for me. And Wayne, one last comment on this.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. You know, I think what I would want to say is, firstly, it's sort of like we're trying to pull, if Richard said, for example, there's been no previous planning process on this. Well, the reality is my client objected to the official plan and took the matter to the tribunal and was successful in having the lands redesignated as community residential. And according to the regulations, the land should be designated in the community residential precinct by virtue of its, you know, the boundaries within the official plan. I'd also say as well that in the background study for the CPP bylaw, there was reference to other municipalities, and they were referred to as sort of best studies or, you know, examples of how this whole thing works. And I reviewed the bylaws for the municipalities, which included Innisfil, Waterfront, Carleton Place, Gananoque, and I also looked up the others that were referenced, and there were about 8 bylaws or 8 municipalities. Not one of them purports to try to use a development designation as a way of sort of withholding establishing a correct precinct on it. Not one of them. And so what's being proposed is sort of like, well, we like the fact that we could do rural under the zoning bylaw. So why don't we bring that forward into this new bylaw, even though the regulations don't allow us to do that? Because it's a convenient way. Everybody knows that the land's not going to be developed rural. You know, like on Earls Road, you know, it's in the urban service area. It's meant to be serviced, and so everybody should reasonably presume it's not going to be a farm. If it's zoned rural, it could be. But the reality is, it's sort of like we're cherry picking things to try to ensure something happens that it has to happen just by virtue of the planning process in Ontario. And so we're making much to do about nothing, but my clients have a good reason to be concerned.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very much appreciate your comments. Thank you. All right. Are there any other comments from committee? Yes, Councillor Stone.
There was just one thing omitted from the presentation today that was in our package, and it was water access only properties, the necessity for them to have parking on the mainland, or at least an agreement. And that was omitted in the presentation today, and I'm just wondering why.
I will ask Richard, thanks.
Thanks. Through you, Madam Chair. Actually, Paul did mention that. So I'm not sure if there was, maybe just to reiterate, we did add provisions in the general provisions section that deal with access. And we did spell out, because we did hear comments about it, that we spelled out that for water access only lots with mainland parking requirements, we needed to basically secure what that parking requirement, how that parking requirement was going to be met. So there was a provision change related to that, and that was the reason. We did hear comments about that, and I'm not sure if you had anything else to ask about that.
I'm not seeing Councillor Stone. Are you okay with that one? Okay, Your Worship?
That's fine.
My question is for the second resolution. I don't know if we're on it yet, the one to.
We are
still just
not,
doing the-
we're not,
I'll save
and
it
we'll
then,
get to
thanks.
that, but I just wanted to get through the content of the CPP itself. If I can use this opportunity, and maybe I'm not supposed to as chair, but I do have a question, if I may, if committee will let me. In the background report, Richard, there's a reference that the CPP will be in line with the town's official plan. The goals of the CPP bylaw include, and in there's reference to protect rural lands for agricultural purposes, resource extraction and production. And one of the comments that was presented in the myriad of letters and all of those things that we received, there was somebody, an organization that was interested in what we were doing from an agricultural perspective. So, and I did read the response, and the response made reference to the fact that we don't have any Class 1 agricultural lands, therefore we don't do anything. And my concern is, and maybe this should have been picked up before, my apologies, but I look at this, we've actually highlighted the fact that we're going to protect rural lands for agricultural purposes, and yet there's absolutely nothing in our CPP, no reference to agricultural lands, how we define them, how anything. And in fact, we have rural lands that if someone came forward and said that they want to develop it for agricultural or for other purposes other than agriculture, and we do have a number of Class 2 agricultural properties. How would we deal with this given this particular policy?
Thank you. So through you, Madam Chair, that comment was a relatively recent one that we received. It was from, I believe I can't recall who provided it, but it maybe Simcoe Muskoka Health Unit, who attended our open house for the official plan amendment. And what they were asking about was about abattoirs. So
They were, but they also had a follow-up with respect to agricultural lands.
right. So I think what the response was in relation to mostly to the abattoir request and that was a request that we permit abattoirs, and that just was a use that was not permitted in the town previously. So we weren't, going to add it. We weren't thinking of adding it through this process. And then I felt that the comment was saying that because there's provincial policies about promoting, preservation of prime agricultural land and promoting agriculture in sensitive crop areas, I think it was about. That's why I said we don't have those in our jurisdiction. So, or that's why we said we don't have those in our jurisdiction. I do think that we have policies in this CPP bylaw about agricultural protection, and they're the minimum distance separation policies. So if there is a agricultural use and there's a barn, then we would require that those minimum distance separations be maintained in accordance with provincial guidance. So that is in there. And then in terms of the rural area and, making sure that we regulate or that we control conflict of uses, and we ensure that uses normally that occur in the rural area can be protected. We obviously have policies that promote development first and foremost in our settlement areas. We obviously have policies in our official plan about not permitting too many severances in the rural area. And we have policies about ensuring that residential development doesn't occur next to sensitive land uses in the rural areas. So I think there are provisions in there that we could definitely use to ensure that those OP policies are addressed.
Okay, I appreciate that. So in essence, what you're saying is if someone came forward with an application to convert rural lands that are currently being used for agriculture, and they want to convert them into some sort of rural residential, that we will fall back in our policies in the official plan, because we actually have nothing in our CPP that allows us to, it gives us teeth. So
Yeah.
it falls on the OP.
Yeah, and there is a very important provision in the CPP bylaw that says the criteria that we're supposed to consider permit applications against. One of them is conformity with the official plan. So those, that's a very important provision that we would use every application we look at.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Anyone else who? Okay, may I ask another question? I'm chair, so I'm gonna ask another question. The mapping, and this sort of semi falls into the next category, but it is very much relevant to the existing draft. I'm still a bit concerned, since we recently had, recent submissions about confusion around properties and what zones they're in and all of that. I actually, out of curiosity, looked at my property and where it is, and I know it's in a special policy area. And given all of the different overlays, the road that I live on wasn't actually identified in the mapping. So I had to kind of guess where my property might be, and frankly, I wasn't sure where it falls. So I don't know if that's because I'm looking at it on a laptop, or if it's better, on the, I don't know if this is just in conversion to an individual looking at it, or if our mapping is what we see. And I'm wondering if we are continuing to work on improving the legibility of it, and so that is kind of a question.
That's a great question. So there's a couple things. When the bylaw is in force, our TOM tool, which is the Town of Huntsville Interactive Mapping Tool, the precinct mapping would be uploaded to that, and you would be able to turn it on and off again and zoom into your property and see it in relation to roads and other mapping elements that we have. So I think that will help a lot with what you've just described. And then I'm not sure the exact issue that you're pointing out, but there has always been an issue with respect to the lot fabric in the town, and it's recently been vastly improved in the MPAC updated parcel layer. So one thing that we will be doing, and we haven't done it with the zoning bylaw yet either, but one thing we will be doing, working with the district, is realigning most of our planning layers so that they would match that new vastly improved parcel fabric. So I think that those two things would help address the situation you've raised.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Richard. And my last comment on this is, in the district comments and our response to it, with respect to our assessment around things like the D4 assessment. And as we know, when the district asks us to do a D4 assessment for a particular application, committee has always had the right to waive those. And I couldn't tell from our response that with the community planning permit system, if we were saying, when the district comes forward and says you should have the applicant prepare a D4 assessment, if you still have the right to waive that, or if that's something that would come to planning council, how would that work? Is there still the same flexibility? Because it didn't look like we were continuing with our flexible approach. And I think that's a really important tool that we currently have.
So that's a good question. So from my understanding, the policies in the district official plan are what they were asking us to ensure is that the CPP bylaw reflects their policies. We also have policies about waste management sites, or these non-operating waste management sites, and the requirements for technical studies, D4 studies. So I think I'm not sure the flexibility actually exists in the policy currently as written. So the CPP bylaw reflects what is in the OP policies. The one thing that I think was added is, and I don't have the printout in front of me, but I think there was, what was added is that you could require a technical study, or that would be prepared in accordance with ministry standards, or that you could prepare a study that satisfies district staff when they ask for it. So I think that's the way that was addressed. I'm not sure if anyone else has anything to add on that.
It definitely, you've identified the way I interpreted it was addressed, and in my opinion, when I read that, it looks like we now, any applicant coming forward would have to address that and prepare a study or satisfy district staff. And we have had numerous cases around this table where we've had the flexibility to say, we'd rather not. It doesn't make sense. So I am personally uncomfortable with that. I don't know how you build that flexibility back in, and in what body, you know, whether that's planning council or the new body that deals with that. But I'm not comfortable saying, okay, that's it. We now have to apply that as a given going forward.
Yeah, okay, that's really good feedback. I think that is one mechanism that we could use. Obviously, if there's an issue with the D4 study, is it could be sent to Planning Council for them to look at whether or not it merits that being a condition of approval or not. So yeah, and that's basically the approach now. Staff follows the policy, asks for
Right.
the relevant studies, but then it's looked at the council or the committee level, and yeah. So I think that still could occur.
Okay, that's useful, and I know Kirsten is about to jump in and respond to this as well. My only comment on that, though, is that given this new process, that would mean staff would have to bump it to a different level in order to get feedback from Planning Council. It might not have been in that stream, so it could be a little problematic, but Kirsten may tell me I'm wrong.
Thank you, Chair Alcock. I was just going to echo what Richard said. Absolutely, the flexibility is there for Planning Council to determine whether or not they require that in order to approve the community planning permit. However, it would need to be bumped, but we would be obviously aware of it and making sure that when we are presenting to any applicants that these are things that are required, if there's any concerns, it would be bumped to. I think there'll be multiple situations where that'll be happening as we work through the process moving forward, and then we'll be able to address them when they come along.
That's very helpful. As long as that flexibility is still there. I would hate that all of a sudden we've just locked ourselves in and we have no recourse. So, okay, that's great. And I had other questions, but that's okay. I can save a couple of them for our next item. So are there any other questions with respect to this very big motion before us? Okay, I do have a parking question, last one. Last question, I promise, and that was with reference to the parking. And I appreciate the effort to decrease the parking requirements around multis. I was curious if there had been any thought as to doing the same for townhouses or row housing, or if what the rationale was that we require 2 parking spaces per townhouse.
Yes, so thank you, through you. We don't often get that request for the townhouse developments. I think it is a different form of development than the multi-residential, where we often get a request for a parking reduction. So I think we added this because we were hearing it so often. And it's obviously it's in the spirit of helping to reduce how many cars are on the road. So we were happy to look at our provisions and see what we could do to reduce the requirement. So we haven't heard this type of request so often on townhouse developments. Typically, that would indicate that that the market for those products aren't. It wouldn't be as successful, I don't think, unless you had those 2 parking spaces. So we didn't explore that.
Okay, that's great, Richard. And it was probably a silly question, but I had to ask it, and thank you for the response. That's helpful. Okay, with that, I am going to,
Sorry to interject. Through you, Chair, I was just going to mention that Richard had prepared the amendments that were outlined in the presentation. So there, based on that motion, there is a list of amendments, but we would need a mover and seconder.
Okay, I need a mover, and so will you post the amendments?
Yes, I
I
can
see
post them.
Councillor Weed, seconded by Councillor Stone. All right, I didn't have the amendments in front of me, so my apologies. Okay, so would you like me to read the proposed amendment? Okay, it has been moved, well, I said that by Councillor Weeb and seconded by Councillor Stone. Be it resolved that Planning Committee recommends approval of the Community Planning Permit Bylaw attached to Report Development 2022-120 as Attachment 4 with the following amendments. 1, revised map number B7, this is testing my eyes, well, here we go, to include the original road allowance on Treasure Island between Part Lot 10, Concession 11, Chaffee, and Part Lot 11, Concession 11 and 12, Chaffee, known municipally as the original road allowance on Treasure Island within an open space precinct. 2, revised map numbers, F9 and F92 to change precincts on Part Lot 20, Concession 2, Chaffee, designated as Part 2 on Plan 35R-1322-5, known municipally as 133 and 143 Chaffee Township Road, from an urban residential medium precinct to a development precinct. 3, revised map number F-10 to change the precinct on Part Lots 26 and 27, Concession 1, Chaffee, designated as Parts 2 and 3 on Plan 35R-17-87 and Part 9 on Plan 35R-9419, known municipally as 1030 Highway 60, from open space precinct to a development precinct. 4, that's okay, revised, okay, this is a test. This is a test, okay. Revised map number F10 to change precincts on Part Lots 24, and 25, and 26, Concession 2, Chaffee, designated as Part 4 on Plan 35R-18082 and Part 4 on Plan 35R-17983, known municipally as 146 and 245 Grandview Drive North, from a resort residential precinct to a development precinct. 5, revised map number F11 to change precincts on Part Lot 35, Concession 2, Chaffee, designated as Part 1 on Plan 35R-16467, and Parts 1 and 2 on Plan 35R-25693, known municipally as 42 and 100 Grassmere Road, from waterfront backlot precinct to a rural precinct. Revised map numbers K-3 and K-4 to change precincts on various lots in Part Lot 17, 18, 19, and 20, Concessions 5 and 6, Stevenson, designated as Part 2 on Plan 35R, 11244, Part 12 on Plan 35R, 3648, Part 1 on Plan 35R, 11584, Part 1 on Plan 35R, 15463, Part 3 on Plan 35R, 25778, and Part 1 on Plan 35R 13419, Parts 1 and 2 on Plan 35R 4046, Part 3 on Plan 35R 4046, and Part 3 on 35R 8824, known municipally as 0. 81 255 268 288 295 357 371 Greer Road and 150 South Mary Lake Road, from Community and Rural Business Employment to Development Precinct. And 7, revised map number K4 to change the precinct on Part Lot 22, Concession 6, Stevenson, known municipally as 476 South Mary Lake Road, from a development precinct to open space precinct. Any questions or comments on any of those? Did I miss the second? I could have. Did I miss one? Did I? All right, now, no questions or comments with respect to the proposed amendment. So all those in favor of the proposed amendment? That carries unanimously. So I would also call the question, all those in favor of the original motion with the proposed amendment? And that carries unanimously. Thank you all. With that, I need a 5-minute, I know we've got a related thing. I need a 5-minute break, if that's all right with everybody. 5-minute biological break. So that pulls us back at 3:21. Thank you very much. I just got the signal that we're good to go, and thank you for allowing us to take a quick biological break. So I'm going to start by reading the second half of this 8.1 agenda item, which is I have a motion. It has been moved by Councillor Fitzgerald, seconded by Councillor Stone. It is recommended that Planning Committee recommends a $15,000 change order be authorized to extend an existing contract to permit preparation of education and implementation materials in support of the community planning permit bylaw as outlined in the scope of work contained in Attachment 3 to Report Development 2022-120 to be funded through the Planning Policy Reserve. And I'm not turning it over to Richard because he spoke to this in his presentation, but I will ask committee if there are questions or comments with respect to this motion. Your Worship.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'm just surprised, one, that something like this wasn't prepared as part of the bylaw. The actual first section of our bylaw says how to read this bylaw, and yet we're being asked to approve another amount of money to do a companion guide, with the first thing being how to read this bylaw. So I feel like it's a bit of a grasp, and I really don't think that there's people out there looking for the companion guide to this unless they're actually planning to apply for a rezoning or a severance or something. And if this is a guide for our staff to be able to implement the bylaw and converse with the public, that's something different, but I don't see it being a companion guide for the public.
Okay, I'm going to ask Richard or Richard, if you heard that, and would you like to respond as to the use of this $15,000, please?
Sure. Sure, I can. So thank you. Good question through you, Madam Chair. So I think what this would really do is translate a lot of the heavy text that's in the bylaw into more of a palatable, not a palatable, I guess, an easier to digest format. So more graphics and visuals to help relay the same information that's currently in text into an easier to read document. So I really do think it's going to be helpful for something like this. And I think some of the comments we've heard throughout really do lend themselves, or really do suggest that something like this would be helpful. I can see us using it not just for staff as an implementation tool, but also as an education tool. We're going to need to update our website with all new information. As I said, we're going to need to update all our policies relating to planning matters, and the content for all that, the website, the policy documents, I believe it would come from this document. So the previous contract was just for bylaw development, and I believe we had a really good rate, really good work that was done, and I think that yeah, it's just a companion document that will distill all that information into an easier to read piece. And I don't know if Kirsten has anything to add, but that's what I would say.
Okay, Kirsten does have her light on, so she would like to add.
Thank you, Chair Alcock. One of the things we've heard multiple times from the public when we were talking about the CPP is how complicated it seemed and how awkward it was to use and how nobody really understood what we were proposing. And I totally recognize that for the layperson, most people don't recognize what a minor variance is or how a zoning bylaw works either. But because we're doing something so incredible, I think, and different, we really felt it was important to have more information available that the general public could understand more easily. The other side of it is that we were thinking that if we had this additional information that was more legible for people off the street to be able to understand, that it would also help the department with the general inquiries. Real estate agents would be able to figure it out without having to call us necessarily, and then more members of the public would be able to look at it and say, okay, I do need a permit, I don't need a permit, I don't have to go to town hall, I do need to talk to somebody. So that was the other side of it, is thinking that we would be able to alleviate some of the stress that the department is feeling just in general.
Your Worship.
Yeah, thanks, and I certainly understand where you're coming from, but honestly, this would have been great to have had as we went through the process. When people can't understand this, and including us at the table are trying to read maps that we can't read, maybe the companion guide should have been developed in conjunction with this plan. Maybe we all might have been understanding what we were doing today instead of, now deciding it's time to let the public understand.
If I may, on that last comment, I concur. I totally support this motion for all of the reasons you've just talked about. But one of the things that we've always been taught is that, all of these policies that we deal with every month, planning documents, and it's a different language. And one of the things you learn is that we have to be able to convey in plain English what we're talking about. And as I was going through all of the comments and our feedback yesterday, and there were moments with some of the explanations, I was still confused. And I thought, I've been over this a million times. So I'm absolutely supportive. I wish, in a way, we had this companion document as we went through. Having said that, it changed throughout. So it would have been probably a lot of wasted time on some things that weren't there or whatever. Having said that, I absolutely support it, and if it can be put into plain language, I know many other municipalities do that for their regular planning processes around zoning and all of that. That would be really, really helpful. Councillor Armour.
I want to say I agree with everything that's been said, but I think a good thing about this new education package is maybe for the new people coming to sit at this table, so they have a better understanding because they haven't been part of the process. So you'll be saving yourself a lot of questions, maybe. So.
Okay, and any other questions, comments? No? I will call the question. All those in favor? And that carries unanimously. Thank you. We are moving to 8.2, and Kelsey, you are up with Report Development 2022-122, SPA 68, 2022, HD, and 24 Meadow Park Drive.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. The subject property is, through you, Madam Chair, the subject property is located at 24 Meadow Park Drive. Oops. The lot is designated urban residential in the urban settlement area and is zoned residential for holding with exception 0502. The applicant is seeking site plan approval to permit the construction of a 3-story, 12-unit stacked townhouse building. Planning Committee considered a zoning bylaw amendment for this property, and Council approved the application on January 24th, 2022. This current site plan is to implement the development that was approved through the site plan amendment. The proposed development is in keeping with the character of the residential area and is compliant with the reliefs approved through the rezoning application. The gross density is approximately 70.5 units per gross hectare, which exceeds the 60 units per gross hectare maximum for high density. However, it was noted that the development is intended for long-term rental accommodation, and the developer is also committed to building pedestrian infrastructure to address the missing connections identified in the town's master sidewalk plan. So here's the elevations. And here's the landscaping plan. It doesn't always transfer well to the PowerPoint, so if you need anything zoomed in, I could do that after. The town's operations department had no concerns. In regards to the sidewalk, a cash contribution shall be provided to the town for future sidewalk consideration, as previously agreed upon. The district commented and said they're just their general comments in terms of connecting to municipal services. The application conforms to the official plan and seems to be consistent with the provincial policy statement, and therefore staff are recommending the approval of this site plan. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that, Kelsey. I'm wondering if the applicant or their representative is with us in person or electronically and would like to add anything to that presentation.
Chair Alcock, I see no hands raised electronically.
Thanks so much, Jen. All right, so I have a motion, and it has been moved by Councillor Armour, seconded by Councillor Fitzgerald. Be it resolved that the Director of Development Services approve site plan application SPA 68 2022 HT, and that the agreement be prepared to the satisfaction of the town, and further that the mayor and clerk are hereby authorized to sign any necessary documentation conditional on all final plans and drawings being to the satisfaction of the town and all other commenting agencies. Are there questions or comments? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? And that carries. Thank you for that, Kelsey. And Kelsey, you're still up. We're moving right along to Development 2022-122 SPA 68. No, I'm sorry. You are moving to previous business. My apologies. With report number Development 22-124 S2021-06 and Z06 2021 HT Black Forest Development Inc.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, the subject property is located at 755 Hoodstown Road and 55 Vernon Shores. This item is back before you after a joint public meeting with the district and Planning Services Committee. At the meeting, committee heard from the applicant, agents, the Lake Vernon Association, and members of the public. Concerns regarding the impact to the natural environment, wildlife habitat, and further shoreline development were raised. The snake emergence study, which was outstanding at the time of the public meeting, has now been provided. The study detailed 3 spring surveys of the potential snake hibernicula on proposed Lot 1. Based on the surveys, the old foundation was deemed not to be used as a snake habitat. As a result, the feature was not classified as potential significant wildlife habitat. The constraint mapping and the building envelope were updated accordingly, as well as the zoning schedule. The flood-related constraints on the site are now identified as natural resource zone and includes all lands below the still water elevation for Lake Vernon. So I have included the updated zoning schedule here. As I mentioned in my earlier presentation, these PDFs that surveyors do don't necessarily convey well to the PowerPoint format, so I have a copy if you need anything zoomed in, but I thought I would just highlight some of the zoning. So the white is the conservation zone. The red is the RU2 with exception. The green is the shoreline residential with exception, and the blue is the natural resource that shows where the flood elevations are. Concerns were raised by members of the public and the Lake Vernon Association regarding potential adverse impacts to the lake, wildlife, and surrounding environment. Commenters requested an independent consultant be hired to ensure mitigation measures are implemented, a benthic study of Lake Vernon, preservation of the bobolink habitat and type 1 fish habitat, and development of less lots with greater frontage. Looking at the issues raised, the EIS concluded that development could proceed on the property with minimal negative impacts on the natural features and functions of the site, provided the recommendations and mitigation measures are implemented through the approved plans. The peer review response was prepared and was to the satisfaction of the peer reviewer. Looking at the benthic study requested, the environmental consultant suggested that it's not an appropriate means to follow the changes of water quality on the lake as a whole. It is the appropriate measure to measure this lake as a whole, but not a suitable study to determining if the proposed docks will result in negative impacts to the water quality across the lake. According to the provided studies, the implementation of mitigation measures and the development of septic envelopes within the zoning schedule have been provided to ensure protection of water quality. The subdivision agreement will also reference the studies for the subject lands to ensure conformity. Mapping of the shoreline will implement dock and boathouse locations outside of type 1 fish habitat, and natural resource and conservation zoning, which I showed, will also help, will also protect, identify bobolink habitat, wetland areas, and associated buffers. A clause has also been added has been included in the subdivision agreement to require site plan control or development permit prior to any vegetation removal. The requirement for an agreement or permit will further assure compliance with the zoning provisions. Based on our further review, the applications would appear to conform with the intent of the official plan and be consistent with the provincial policy statement, and therefore staff are now recommending approval. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kelsey. I would again ask if the applicant or their representative is here. Would they like to speak to this application?
Just be very brief.
Okay.
It's been a long meeting.
Thank
I think I think Kelsey outlined the application well. That zoning schedule is going to tie down the location of the building envelopes and ensure that the vegetation on the balance of those large lots is retained. The septic location is clearly identified. I would also mention that there is a 30-meter setback from the water's edge there. And as Kelsey had mentioned, the shoreline was identified for type 1 and type 2 fish habitat. That's been identified on the zone schedule as well. And all the environmental studies have been peer-reviewed by the district through a sub-consultant, Hutchinson, and they were satisfied that it meets the intent of the local and district official plan. From here, we would go to the district for the final approval of the subdivision. And again, I think some of the comments that were raised at the meeting were valid as far as what had happened on another property. And my client has made it clear that he will put that front and center, that people aren't supposed to be going in there until they have their site plan or development permit, and keeping closely with the development envelope. So I just wanted to relay that. I'd be glad to answer any questions if you had any. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, John. Okay, so I am going to read a motion I have before me. It has been moved by Councillor Fitzgerald and seconded by Councillor Stone. It is recommended that Planning Committee approve zoning bylaw amendment Z06-2021 HT, the purpose and effect of which is to rezone the subject lands from a rural 2 zone and shoreline residential 5 zone to a natural resources zone and conservation zone to prohibit development in identified natural constraints on the subject lands, rural 2 with exception, to permit the creation of 3 proposed waterfront backlots to limit the placement of building structures and septic systems, and shoreline residential 2 with exception to facilitate the creation of 10 proposed new shoreline lots with restrictions to control the location of docking facilities, vegetation retention, and placement of building structures and septic systems. So I do have another motion, but I will ask committee if they have any questions with respect to this motion. Yes, Your Worship.
Yeah, just one quick question. The mapping and everything shows the location of the docks, but there's verbiage in the report that talks about docks and boathouses. Do we have approval for docks only, or are there boathouses approved in this as well?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Madam Chair. In accordance with our bylaw, boathouses are not permitted within type 1 fish habitat. So if it's outside type 1 fish habitat, a boathouse would be permitted within the same prescribed location for docks and boathouses. Yes. I don't know if that answers.
Does that answer your?
You just about lost me, I think. So if the dock is allowed in the fish habitat, so is the boathouse, correct?
Apologies.
Two,
I got too ahead of myself. So the dock location and the boathouse location shown in gray on the zoning schedule have been specifically identified outside of type 1 fish habitat. So if it's outside of type 1 fish habitat, it would permit a dock or a boathouse. hope that is more understandable.
Thank you, Chair, through you. In Lot 7 with that center line water course, how would they navigate that to actually go through Lot 6 too?
Thank you for the question, through you, Madam Chair. So as it would be under site plan control, we'd ask for vegetation to be removed. No, not removed, retained. That would be the opposite. Throughout that conservation zone, and for there to be appropriate setbacks. Well, the buffer does have the appropriate setback, but that development would be outside of that. So it would be reflected in the site plan application.
Sorry. Yes, Councillor Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Chair Alcock. I guess I'm curious as to we go through the process of the septics and setbacks and everything. No accounting for wells if required.
Thank you for the question. So the wells would have to be in compliance with Ontario Building Code. So they'd have to be appropriately set back from the septic. I don't know if Director Maxwell had any other comments on that, on whether they should be further identified.
Thank you, Chair Alcock. I would just note that we don't regulate the wells the same way that we do septic systems. So as long as they're meeting the requirements of the building code, then it's permitted.
Thank you for that. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions or comments, so I will call the question on this particular motion. All those in favor? And that carries unanimously. Thank you. So we do have another motion with respect to this file, and it has been moved by Councillor Fitzgerald, seconded by Councillor Armour. It is recommended that Planning Committee recommend to the District of Muskoka that subdivision application S 2021-06 be approved, conditional on the conditions of approval being included as listed in attachment 4 to this report, and that the mayor and clerk be authorized to sign any necessary documentation related to subdivision application S 2021-06. Any other questions, comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? And that carries. So thank you for that, Kelsey. And we don't have any new business, and we don't have any general information. I'm looking over to our chair, to our director. Okay, so I have a motion moved by Councillor Fitzgerald, seconded by Councillor Armour. It is recommended that we do hereby adjourn at 3:48 p.m. All those in favor? And that one carries unanimously. Councillor Stone's very good with that one. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Long day.